it going? Uh,
Yeah, so
Jared,
I just gave it a try and looks like I was.
oh, Alper is the host. All right. Let me just tell Jared not to worry. All right. Hello, folks. Oh, the cloud recording request timed out, but we're still recording, right? Yes. Okay. Hello, everybody. Crazy start to the Upjet meeting this week, but we're on the go now. I'll start just with a quick update. So no Upjet specific kind of like improvements on the go from our side. Mostly on the provider side, we're working on updating the Terraform providers for provider GCP at the moment. And some resources are being added to provider AWS. So hopefully we'll be able to see those go out in the near term. Blake, glad to see you on the call. Anything you would like to raise to bring to the agenda today?
I think the only thing that I'm kind of interested in is the moving resources to storage true with regards to the new singleton list embedded objects.
Righty, let's put this on. I don't know who originally added it to the agenda. Before I started taking names, I just accepted it. But does anybody know of an issue that speaks to this in Upjet? Let me quickly search. Matt's here as well.
Hi there.
Hey, Matt.
Hi, Matt.
Not finding an issue easily with the storage true. No, maybe it was from a Slack conversation.
Yeah,
Matt, any does it ring a bell?
I just read the Slack thread about that. There was a
Oh, really?
yeah, it was definitely in Slack
Oh, okay.
about the
let's see
storage
if
true
yeah.
and the documentation
Let's see if I can
showing
find
which version. It was in SIG Upjet.
I know I brought it up at the community meeting, and then I think I maybe had thrown a message before in SIG Upjet.
I think you posted it in general and then shared a link to that message in SIG Upjet. So probably maybe the fastest way to get there
Yeah.
is the link in the less popular channel.
Gotcha. I can at least give context to what I understand.
Yeah.
So right, the singleton list change, right? So now there's a lot less lists in the CRs. Any resource that got changed, we created a new API version for. But my understanding is that when I started looking at it, because I was like, well, I'm going to migrate my stuff over to use V1 Beta 2. And what I noticed is that it's not actually the storage resource. So I didn't know if that should hinder my migration to V1 Beta 2 or what the like roadmap was, because I didn't really read anything documented about like what is the next steps for those new CR versions or CRD versions. Like, is that the default version we should all be using, or is that just kind of a like if you're creating new resources, that's the one you should be using, or like what is the standard on that?
Yeah, I'm especially interested in the what do we want to do for new resources? Should we create new resources with two versions or not?
So maybe I can try to give an answer to it. So once you start generating the new versions, the expected API for the new ones will not contain singleton lists, right? So in the new versions of the APIs, you should be seeing embedded objects instead of singleton lists. However, you also continue to have the old versions with the singleton lists. So in the official providers, we chose this way because we had to be backwards compatible. We wanted to roll out this feature with a minor version bump and then another major version bump. That's why we ended up with both versions, with the singleton list APIs and the embedded object APIs. So for the official providers, if it's convenient, if you prefer, you can start using the new versions of the APIs with the embedded objects, and you don't need to worry about the old APIs. But if you have existing clients that use the singleton list APIs, I mean the old APIs, let's say V1 Beta 1 APIs, then they should also be working as expected. So we installed the necessary conversion webhooks and the necessary layer that we need to be able to convert between the CR layer and the Terraform layer. So that it's we should be staying backwards compatible. If not, we will consider it as a bug. But if you are maintaining your own provider and you don't worry about backwards compatibility, then you don't need to generate, you don't need to keep the old APIs.
So I guess, what is the timeline for moving storage from V1 Beta 1 to V1 Beta 2, or is that never going to happen?
Okay, so we will at some point move the storage version, as you mentioned, we will advance it. But right now, we kept the storage version pointing to the older V1 Beta 1 APIs. And the reason behind it, let's say you upgrade your provider and, when you do so, let's say you get the V1 Beta 2 versions of the CRDs. So if we had declared the storage version as V1 Beta 2, then they would be overridden. The existing resources in HCD would be overridden with the V1 Beta 2 version. And let's say you immediately decide for some reason, you see that, it's not working as expected, and you just want to roll the provider version back. So since we rolled out these features in a backwards compatible manner with a minor version bump, we did not want to break the downgrade scenario. Currently, it's possible because the storage version is the V1 Beta 1 version, right? So if you roll out, if you roll back the provider to the previous version, then, since the new version, the new shape of the API has not been stored in HCD, downgrade should just work and, you can continue using the old version. But let's say when we release the 2.0.0 version of provider AWS, then we have a chance to bump the storage version because we will not be caring about downgrades. And even we can also, we have not decided to do so, but when we bump the provider version to 2.0.0, then, backwards compatibility is also not our concern, and we can just remove the old singleton list-based APIs.
Gotcha. I just didn't know if there was an
Yeah.
issue to, let's say, to track that progression. I guess it would be interesting to know, is it planned for a 2.0 release that we set storage version to the new ones, and then in future release just actually straight up remove them, or would we do that in one? I think an issue to track that would be, and I don't know if there is one. I didn't see one when I looked, but I could have been looking in the wrong place as well.
No, there isn't one yet, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but going to a 2.0 is not on the near-term roadmap, at least from a need from outbound side.
Right.
Our customers are quite sensitive to breaking changes, and so we try and always do backwards compatible actions. But that doesn't mean there doesn't a reality arises in the near future where 2.0 might not be needed. That's always the case, but we don't have any strong motivation to drive a 2.0 right now.
One additional consideration around the storage version is that at least my experience looking at Terraform provider AWS is that the schema is sometimes wrong. And the schema says things like max items 1, and we're relying on that. And then But if for this particular resource that doesn't make sense, either because AWS releases some change or it's a bug in the Terraform provider that they fix, then the Terraform provider will just relax that constraint. And now, if we have converted that to an embedded object, we can't express a list with more than one item there without sort of having to go back to the list-based API. So as long as there is a like strict enforcement of max items 1, then you can go in both directions. But if that enforcement is weak, it's a one-way conversion. And so keeping the storage version as the more expressive but less convenient to use probably singleton list, probably dash singleton list version is sort of the safer option from the perspective of unknown future Terraform provider changes that are sort of outside of our control.
Then I guess, I mean, I definitely understand like that it makes this CRDs easier to use. But outside of that, then if that's if that's a major concern, which I do agree like is a concern, why even make the change to begin with? Why not always just say uniform Terraform?
I think it had mostly to do, I think it had to do with service side apply and the way things were got merged,
Yeah.
but I don't remember the details on that.
Yeah, it became tedious to set server-side apply hints for the old structure.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and this originated from a request during the provider GCP's work. Jonathan, who joined the call back then, was trying to create like an implementation specifically to overcome that limitation. And at that point, we discussed and said, look, you know, there's potentially a better way to implement this at the object level, which is what Alper did.
Gotcha. Because I'm just trying to think like if I'm using V1 Beta 2, for example, and let's say AWS made a change or Terraform made a change, we're saying, hey, this is no longer a singleton list. This is right a multi-object list. Then I run into a problem where I don't know how, without a breaking change, my V1 Beta 2 actually like how I can use that CRD version anymore. I guess I could backwards compatible it to V1 Beta 1, right? But
yeah, so in that case, like, you know, we will be, let's say Terraform does a schema change and, you know, a list that was a singleton list previously becomes, you know, a multi-item list, right? So that's a schema change. And what we should be doing, like, you know, we will be generating a new version of this for this resource. But in that case, the conversion will not be easy. Like, you know, these versions are different representation, must be different representations for the same object. So when a list becomes a singleton list becomes a multi-item list, you cannot directly convert between these two fields, right? So there are some techniques to overcome this, and you know we can implement them via our conversion webhooks. But when something happens, and you know if that happens during a minor version bump for the official AWS provider, then what we will be doing is, like, you know, we will be generating, as you mentioned, V1 Beta 3, and also we will be shipping the proper conversion functions, like, you know, which are invoked by the conversion webhooks, you know, to keep backwards compatibility. And in that case, if you are using V1 Beta 1, then you would be creating your resource using a singleton list, and you have no option to create a multi-item list, right? Because the API doesn't support it. What I'm saying is not 100% true, by the way. As I mentioned, they are in fact different representations for this for the same thing. So probably via annotations. So I didn't detail the techniques, but you know, one technique is to use annotations. So even if you are creating your resource v1 beta 1, you can put the proper annotations to declare a multi-item list, for example. But let's forget about it. And then if you are using v1 beta 2, then you will be using an embedded object. And if you want to create a multi-item list, then you would choose, for example, v1 beta 3. But as I mentioned, how Kubernetes manages these versions is, in fact, they are different representations for the very same object. So they must be equal in their expression power, which means that, in fact, that's why I just said, even with v1 beta 1 and v1 beta 2, if we do our job properly, you will be able to create multi-item lists. But the important thing is it's a schema change, and we cannot just override the last version, for example, v1 beta 2 with a multi-item list. We need to take care of it. Otherwise, we will be just breaking our clients. So things got a little bit complicated because previously we were generating singleton lists as lists without any constraints on the CR level, right? So when we generate the CRDs, we are not generating the associated constraints on them. If we were doing so, even when a singleton list becomes a multi-item list, and let's say we didn't convert it to an embedded object, it will be a breaking change again because the constraints will be changing. But since we don't generate them, if we didn't generate the embedded object, then you will not notice it. Currently, if you have singleton lists in your generated APIs, you can declare a multi-item list in your CR. So the API server will not reject it. But when we pass that data, that configuration parameter down to the Terraform layer, then we break at runtime. So this is certainly not something we are happy with. And we would like to improve this situation by generating the necessary, CRD validation rules. But that's currently the case.
Yeah, it seems like to me, at least as somebody who's building compositions, right, where developers are not interacting with the actual MRs, it very much seems like taking the ownership of not using the singleton list MRs makes more sense because of the complications of, okay, well, now if Terraform changes their schemas, how do I actually make sure that's backwards compatible, and getting that sort of situation figured out seems more complex to me than am I reading the room correctly on that, or?
I mean, I think Terraform folks are also avoiding this. They're also breaking change on their side, right? So if they change the schema of a configuration parameter, then it's a breaking change for them. So I personally don't expect this to be common. But we also know that this will happen. So, sometimes they need to do it. Sometimes they break things. And sometimes, it's caused by bugs. But I personally don't think that, it will be common because it's a breaking change on their side.
Is relaxing a constraint a breaking change?
So, for readers of the API, it's a breaking change. So there are different kinds of breaking changes. So when you think I declare one item here and, the constraint is relaxed, then you can start declaring, multiple items. Then you think that, your manifest will be working. So when you look at the problem in this way, it's not a breaking change, but you should also consider readers of the API. So let's assume there's a client who reads that field and it's written against the older version, in which case, the list contains just one item, right? But suddenly new, objects will contain multiple items, and, this is a breaking change for the older client written against it.
That makes a lot of sense from the general, what is it, breaking change to an API perspective. It makes sense from the Crossplane perspective. I don't think it's a consideration that the maintainers of the Terraform provider care about, because they're building their provider to work with Terraform, and the version, like there are no readers of that API basically. So
there will be readers of the state, right?
there will be readers of the state. Yes, but I don't think that a previous version of Terraform provider X is expected to be able to always read the state of a subsequent version of that same provider. I think, I don't know this for sure, but I think that the recommended mitigation strategy there is just upgrade to the later version of the provider.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't expect that. I mean, maybe they impose that constraint upon themselves, but I wouldn't. That doesn't seem like a safe assumption that like they won't break in that way, because then that would prevent old Terraform provider versions from reading state files from new Terraform provider versions.
so to the best of my knowledge, they have these state migrators, and they ship functions that can migrate state. So when this happens, they try to migrate.
But isn't that only upwards? Do they have downward state migrators too?
No, I don't think so, but I'm not sure. Like, I've seen, as you mentioned, they can work upwards, but if you try to reverse, versioning, I'm not sure whether it will work. But, the important thing is if they break things on their side, if they introduce such breaking changes, then they also have their own means to migrate state and to make it backwards compatible for our users. And when we introduce these multi-version CRDs, we also have a strategy to keep backwards compatibility. That's why I explained, with V1 Beta 3, it will be a breaking API change, but the old APIs should still be working, and we accomplish this via these conversion webhooks, right? We also have some other tooling in the ecosystem that's capable of, performing other, operations. But these multi-version CRDs, we employ these conversion webhooks. And what I'm trying to say, if Terraform makes this change, and if you upgrade your provider, and if we do our job properly, then you should not worry about it, because you will be still able to use the V1 Beta 2 version of your manifests. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it just seems like a lot of extra overhead, at least from the Crossplane or outbound maintenance point of view. Like, it's a lot of extra, versions, things like that I think as an end user, right, complicates my management of Crossplane, because I'm like, okay, now I got 3 different versions that are all available, usable, but they're I don't know, if I'm fresh going into Crossplane, I'm thinking, okay, which one do I use? Do I use V1 Beta 1, V1 Beta 2, or V1 Beta 3? And what's the difference between all of them?
You use the one that shows up when you open the documentation page without clicking anything.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, that's the reality. What's
and the problem is the button
happen
is so small, so I can't even it's so hard for me to
right.
Yeah, so I think, you touched a great point. So, in the ecosystem for the official providers, we should have a policy when to deprecate older versions, when to remove them, and things like that, right? So that, we cannot just continue adding new versions and, keep the version list growing for a single MR. So what I'm just going to say is we have not done this before, but it's technically possible. So we are relying on the existing Kubernetes API evolution, tools and techniques. So we already know it's possible to do. Probably, we should define a policy around, these concepts, and, follow that policy.
And to be fair, I don't know if we have to have a version 2 of the outbound providers to say we're deprecating things in version 2. I think assuming all of them theoretic, give enough time, 6 months, whatever, to
Yeah.
say, hey, you got to move. Like, I think that's reasonable, but I'm also trying to come at it from, I looked at the PR that added singleton objects. It was like 1 million lines of code, at least in the AWS provider. So it's obviously a lot of extra maintenance that I think we can avoid, probably be valuable. Or it's long-term avoid having to do.
This is the provider where when someone says it's like 1 million lines of code, they actually mean 1 million lines of code instead of just meaning big.
Yes.
Yeah, but some of the providers, some of the PRs can get, especially with the code generation, can get absolutely enormous.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I know a lot of it is code-gen, but it's
Right.
It's still code that has to get,
And it actually, that makes it really hard to review.
Yeah.
One thing that I try and do with my PRs is I try and have each commit be either all generated code or no generated code, to try and help reviewers. As a reviewer, I would appreciate if other people did that, at least most of the time. If I'm making a 1-line change in the configuration that results in a 3-line change in the generated code, that doesn't really need to be 2 commits, but so for the singleton list embedded object, I wish those words were not so cumbersome and so easy to mix up. Like it's really easy to say embedded list and singleton object. It seems like as long as the storage version is using the list, migration is not, we're still safe, we're still resilient to the Terraform provider potentially reacting a constraint. And so from the perspective of I'm adding a new resource, it contains lists that are singletons in the Terraform provider. Do I only create the embedded object version, which would then have to be the storage version, could be the only version? And if so, what are the consequences of that? Do we need a different migration strategy for those resources than we would for ones that were created prior to this change, should the constraint be relaxed? Or are we better off having the new resources be the same as the existing resources that have multiple versions? That's sort of a question that I'm not quite sure where I land on, which is going to be better or safer long term. And that's directly relevant as I have open PRs implementing new resources that contain singleton lists.
So, Matt, sorry, I think I missed your question. So you are talking about, what happens if Terraform changes the schema
Right.
for
And we don't have a list-based API in etcd.
Yeah, so you mean embedded object API?
No.
I mean in etcd.
Right now in etcd, all of the APIs are use lists. Because that's the storage version.
Yes.
As long as that remains true, if Terraform says, okay, well, there's a new a new version of the new Terraform provided version, new schema, this list can now have 5 items. It's maybe I'm misreading this because I don't, there's a ton of stuff that I don't know about etcd and Kubernetes, but it seems like that would be an easier transition to make because the storage would already be a list, and so you can it's easy to make a embedded object projection of a list, but it is harder to make it's impossible to, if the storage is as an object, to make the projection be a list with more than 1 item in it, unless maybe that is possible somehow using annotations.
I think I see your question. So the thing is, with multi-version CRDs, you define a hub version, and you have potentially multiple spoke versions, right? So it's a star topology. And the constraint here is you need to be able to convert, between each hub and spoke versions, back and forth. So this makes it possible. For example, let's say you have 3 versions. So it should be possible to convert. And let's say V1 beta 2 is your hub version, and you'd like to convert from V1 beta 1 to V1 beta 3. Then you should have conversions which make it possible to convert from V1 beta 1 to V1 beta 2, which is at the center, and then V1 beta 2, V1 beta 3. And these conversions should be working in both directions, meaning that, if you can convert V1 beta 1 to V1 beta 2, the reverse is also should be possible, V1 beta 2 to V1 beta 1. So if you think on this star topology, then it doesn't matter whatever change you have, as long as you can implement this, you will be safe, right? So
because there's a hard requirement that each spoke in this star topology be bidirectional without any loss of fidelity.
Yes, that's correct. Apparently, you cannot satisfy this via spec fields. So it doesn't matter whether it's single item, multiple item, as long as the schema changes, you cannot satisfy this.
So if I create a new object right now that has a singleton list, it would create a V1 beta 1 version with that singleton list. And if, let's say, Terraform changed the schema, said, hey, now I have a multi, right? We would create a new version in Upbound for V1 beta 2. And the idea would be is V1 beta 1 would have that singleton list. It would convert into V1, if we were changing, it could convert it to V1 beta 2, which can have multiple lists, right? And if I needed to go back, essentially, it would just chop off any other future items and then go back to V1 beta 1. So there's still backwards compatibility on those two. Like obviously on V1 beta 1, I couldn't take advantage of the multi-item list that would be available in V1 beta 2, but I wouldn't.
But that's loss of fidelity. That's the problem.
Yeah,
that
so
the result of that is that a round trip from multi-item to single item and back doesn't result in the original input.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in your case, as long as the underlying provider supports multi-item lists, we can convert between these 2 versions. And then, since the underlying provider expects a multi-item list, things will still be working, right? Is that what you are asking?
I think what maybe I'm hearing some advocation for is when we create a new resource, we should always have a V1 beta 1 version that is in storage that is a multi-item list, regardless as to if it's a singleton in the Terraform schema or not.
That is a list.
Right. And then a V1 beta 2 version that actually just has that singleton list. So that way, if V1, Terraform changed it to a multi-item list, we could do that backwards compatibility without losing fidelity.
I think, so you said V1 beta 2 that has a singleton list, and I think you meant V1 beta 2 that has an embedded object. Is that right?
Sorry. Yes.
Confusing terminology.
I know. It's hard.
Imagine how the Kubernetes API feels.
What do you say, John?
Imagine how the Kubernetes API feels.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, seriously. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
I think
you're doing a good job of sort of rephrasing the kinds of things that I'm advocating for. The nuance that I'm trying to present that I didn't hear from you is that there is a ton of stuff about Kubernetes that I don't know. And I am very much open to the idea that I'm wrong. And that actually this doesn't solve any problems because of various Kubernetes constraints.
So it's like, let's assume the API evolves, the Terraform schema evolves, and we have a multi-item list, right? So we generate a new version. And then what we will do is we will be annotating V1 beta 2 resources if a multi-item list is specified. Think about it in these terms. Then what will get, so let's also assume that the storage version is V1 beta 2. Then what gets stored in HCD is a, embedded, is an object with an embedded object, like, which was previously a singleton list, which became a multi-item list, but in V1 beta 2, it's an embedded object. But since you started with a V1 beta 3 object, we will be putting the extra items in an annotation, right? And then what gets stored on HCD contains your multi-item list. Not on that list alone, because the API doesn't allow it, but via supporting annotations, let's say. And the important thing is we can convert between V1 beta 2 and V1 beta 3 without any loss. You can convert from V1 beta 3 to V1 beta 2 without any loss. And we can supply your multi-item list to the underlying controller. So this is what's important. So it doesn't matter whether we store it inside a field or inside an annotation. The only thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that this conversion works. Like, the conversions that I described on the star topology works.
Okay. So it sounds like based on that, there's not really any advantage to having the list-based storage API from the point of view of insurance against future Terraform provider schema changes. There's other advantages that we've also discussed, but that one is not really valid. The only potential other compatibility concern that I would raise is that everything that you just described is true from the perspective of managed resources and the provider and the Kubernetes API, and doesn't consider the way compositions may be managing the MRs. And I would expect most authors of compositions to not be considering additional list item fields that are present in annotations, because that's weird.
But if you'd like to compose a multi-item list, then the proper way to do it is to switch in your composition to V1 beta 3, right?
So maybe this is not an issue. Maybe this is just as simple as, like, if the composition is using the API version that has an object, then the composition is implicitly expecting that there is only one item, and it will get one item, and there may be additional items present in annotations, which it will just ignore, and that's sort of the best we could do. In this particular case, I think you're right. I think that's fine.
So
Yeah,
the important thing is your existing compositions, which assume that, that list is a singleton list. In your case, maybe, if you are using V1 beta 1, a singleton list, or an embedded object, if V1 beta 2, should continue working as expected and behaving as expected, right? So it's technically possible for us to satisfy these requirements right now.
I think this sounds like a good plan. I think this satisfies the, like, is it technically backwards compatible and forwards compatible in the ways that it needs to be? And it also does a good job of satisfying the sort of principle of least surprise. That, like, if I have a composition that is using an API version that has an object, then my composition is expecting there to be only one item. And so the best that we can do as a provider is ensure that my composition is provided with one item, which we will. And if in order for the composition to properly handle more than one item, it necessarily must be upgraded by the author of that composition. And we can't do that. So this seems like sort of both good enough and the best we can do.
Yeah, the only problem I think is going to be if you have to downgrade, because, like, I'm even looking at, for example, like this is the, I don't know, one resource that seemed to be added last patch. So this is a V1 beta one, and this external connections is a object, but I'm assuming based off the description, it's an array with a singleton list. In
Oh yeah, we
Terraform,
should change the documentation generator.
probably, but my hunch is that, for example, if I use this resource and said, okay, I create this resource with external connections using V1 beta 1, I then go update it to V1 beta 2 because Terraform changed their thing, and Crossplane followed suit. Then I need to roll, I guess if I needed to roll back without having any MRs updated to use an array, I would be okay. But if I then had MRs that had 2 or 3 items in that list, I needed to roll back.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
where,
So yeah, that's a good point. So when we talked about why we kept the storage version as V1 beta 1 with the official providers, when we introduced this singleton list to embedded object conversions, we talked about downgrades, right?
yeah.
But just as you mentioned, if you upgrade your provider and see that, you know, now you have an embedded object, and let's say you decide to bump your MR API version to V1 beta 2 and convert the spec for provider field from a singleton list to an embedded object, right? And now if you try to downgrade, you're in trouble. So, you know, the downgrade scenario that we support is just you upgrade, you don't touch your APIs, and you try to downgrade. So if you make any manual changes to your MR manifests, etc., as part of the upgrade process, then you'll need to manually roll back them.
As long as there is an intermediate version that contains both a list and a object API, and that stores the lower version, can't I always go like, if version 3 is using the object for storage and I need to roll back to version 1, can't I just go from 3 to 2, install 2, let 2 migrate the storage in etcd to the lower version that is the only version in provider version 1, and then install version 1? Would that work?
So I think I missed the scenario that you described.
It sounds like, so it seems like the scenario that you're describing of like where you can't downgrade, where you have where the V1 beta 3 is, I'm getting all mixed up.
Sorry, look, do you want me to try and describe, I think, what the scenario is?
Great.
So this is V1 beta 1 with a singleton list as an, or
Embedded object.
Embedded object. It's an
Not
embedded
singleton list.
If I upgrade, let's say this upgrades to V1 beta 2 that supports multiple items as a list, and this turns into a list, that upgrade can happen safely because there's going to be a conversion webhook that says convert this object into a list. Great. Now I go update my MRs to now have multiple items in my list. I then say, oh crap, I got to roll back. What happens to that list that now maybe have 2 or 3 items when I swap it back to V1 beta 1?
Yeah, so if you don't manually convert your MR API back to the old version, I mean, if you leave your MR,
like a list of 3 or something.
Yeah, with a list, with a multi-item list, then even, you know, and you downgrade the provider, then what will happen is the provider won't be even able to reconcile your managed resource. Because, like, you know, when you roll back, the multi-item list disappears, and the installed CRD says that, you know, a valid, you know, schema for this object is a singleton list schema or embedded object, right? But what's stored in etcd contains a multi-item list at that spec for provider field. And when we try to read it back, when the controller tries to watch it and read it, then it will fail. So you will see log messages saying that, you know, the stored object is not a valid one.
Is that unsolvable?
It's
Because
solvable. So
because the version of the provider that's running in this scenario is now the one that has no knowledge of V1 beta 2.
mhm.
So how could it possibly convert V1 beta 2 into V1 beta 1?
So that's why you need to manually do it. So you manually converted your MR to V1 beta 2, and when downgrading, you need to manually convert it back to the old shape.
But don't you also need to first manually change the storage version?
No. So let's say you decided to downgrade. What I would suggest is you just, you know, convert your API back to the old shape, which is supported by the new version of the provider, and then you do the downgrade.
I guess
So-
my assumption is that in the case where, in this hypothetical case where the constraint gets relaxed and now there's multiple items in this list that was previously a singleton list in the Terraform provider that we were rendering as an embedded object, we do bump the storage version because, oh, but maybe we don't need to, because we
No,
can,
I don't think.
we don't need to bump the storage version because we can rely on annotations, and even though that sucks,
Yeah.
for us, we can take on that burden to maintain compatibility. Okay, great. I don't like that, but
I do think
it's the
that-
right solution.
Yeah, I do think it needs to be documented somewhere of like, hey, this is the steps with this stuff because this is overly complex as we're figuring out. So, like, because I imagine if I'm as an end user, if I'm trying to figure this out and I haven't had this conversation or like haven't had this document and I'm trying to figure out how I can safely downgrade, I'm going to cry. Like,
I can give you a non-hypothetical example of that. I installed provider AWS version 1.0 onto a cluster that was running Crossplane 112, which didn't support some TLS, something related to the conversion webhooks. And so all of the providers all of the like family providers that contained a version change just like crashed and wouldn't come up. Like the pods just would not start. And so I'm faced with downgrading, and I'm looking at this release notes, and I see note, if you're using the exact same things that I am having problems with, you can't downgrade. And so I'm like, well, shit. But this is a project that I am deep in the source code, and I can handle this, and was able to do that. And it involved like shut this thing down, manually edit that. Like it was a pain, but I was able to do it. But that definitely required extraordinary effort that I would not want to expect a normal user who is not also a contributor to the project to have to do.
yeah. Okay,
Right,
sorry.
folks.
We can move on from the topic. I think we covered it very well, but
It was a riveting conversation, especially for somebody with much less technical understanding of these matters. But
How
I'm
many
glad
people?
you all enjoyed
How
it.
long can a bunch of engineers talk about lists versus objects?
Matt, I was hoping to get to your items that you had there. Do you want to do a quick 5-minute dash on them, or should
I'll
we do them
try.
async? All right.
So, let me. I can share my screen here. If I can find the right window. There it is. So looking at these, so this is the IAM role. The way the Terraform provider semantics work, if you specify an empty array for either managed policies or inline policies, it will remove any existing ones, which is, in the context of an operator with a reconciliation loop, a useful way of saying, please enforce that there should be nothing else besides what's defined in Kubernetes. The trouble is it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of the omit empty, I guess serializer comment configuration that we have that Upjet puts on, I think literally every single field of every resource that has a object or array in it. The distinction between null/undefined and defined but contains a quote unquote zero value like empty array or empty object or even empty string is, from my background in like Java programming, is like a, yeah, these are obviously totally different things. And it seems like in the Kubernetes world, they are often like treated as interchangeably. So I'm assuming that something related to that is the reason why we're having this emit empty, but at least for this resource, that doesn't work. And so we need to either stop saying you can set this to an empty array and it'll do this behavior, or make it work. I want to just sort of breeze through these quickly and then we can maybe have time to talk about some of them. This one is a provider pod panic. And what's happening is that in so when we are deleting a Terraform SDK resource, we set instance diff destroy to true, and then we call apply. But the Terraform provider apply method is designed to handle both a delete request and a delete and recreate request. Normally, we don't get into this method at all, this apply method at all, if there's a required new set to true, because we have forbidden that. But if we do get into it, it tries to delete and recreate it. But in this case, the resource is trying to recreate has been deleted, and so it doesn't have any fields defined, and that's what's causing the panic. And the reason in this case why this has a requires new set to true is because of a different bug that is basically there's a perpetual diff in a requires new field. So the state of the resource before deletion was the Terraform state says requires new true, and then Crossplane is saying I can't update this because it requires deleting and recreating. And then you do try to actually delete it, and then I've observed this on other resources that don't, where it doesn't cause a panic, where it actually will delete it, recreate it, and then delete it again. So this is definitely like a general issue. It's especially acute in this case because it causes a panic from an unhandled error in the Terraform provider. And then the third one was about resource creation timeouts. So what's happening here is, oh yeah, so this is related to the RDS-DB, which had a change to the meaning of change to the format of the Terraform ID field. And we had to switch from using provider parameterized identifier to identifier from provider external name configuration when we did the 5.0 upgrade. The result is that if creating a resource that uses identifier from provider or another, or just in general where the correct external name is not known, and that fails, then the provider doesn't know how to recover, but still attempts to recover. There's a like long code comment in Upjet saying like the correct thing to do is to set the external create failed annotation here, but we're not going to do this because we think it'll provide a better experience to not do that. So I guess there's sort of I've got sort of two suggestions here. One is this particular user's issue is caused by they're trying to restore a very large database. It takes more than an hour to create. And so whatever timeout we built into the provider is going to be too short. They need sort of a user configurable timeout. So that's sort of like one feature request. But then the other one is sort of a more wide-ranging change, which is that I think that this will provide a better user experience behavior in Upjet, where we're not setting the external create failed, but just like trying again, is appropriate in cases where we know the external name, either because it was supplied by the user as an annotation, or it's generated from the metadata name or from the spec, but not in the cases where we need to get that from the provider, because in those cases we can query to say, does this resource exist? And we won't create a duplicate. But that same implementation does, and I have seen it result in essentially leaking resources when there's errors. And then it will go create, there was some resource that I was working with, I don't remember which one it was, but I like looked in AWS and all of a sudden I had 24 of them because Crossplane had been creating them over and over and over again because of this issue.
Yeah, Matt, I guess I can talk about this issue. This is very similar to something I observed in the past, and back then I determined that this was indeed a Terraform provider issue. So what happened in my case, which I believe is the same as this one, was Terraform was sending an AWS SDK call to create the RDS instance, and it would just wait for the RDS instance to become available before returning.
Mm-hmm.
And if for some reason, maybe it's a connection problem, maybe it's something else, during that wait, Terraform fails, and it doesn't set instance ID it got from the AWS to the state. So it returns state empty. Therefore, we are not able to set any external names.
Mm-hmm.
And in the next reconciliation loop, we just send the same SDK create call again. And in RDS case, that create call fails, luckily. And you are not, you don't end up with multiple instances of the same RDS. And if user is careful, they will be able to see it in the logs and they will be able to fix it manually.
But in other providers,
resources, yes, in other resources, it may not be the case. For instance, in VPC, I bet in VPC, you'll be able to create new VPCs with those
or
parameters.
security groups,
perhaps,
or things like that.
So yeah, in those cases, we would better be fixing these in upstream Terraform provider, because it's in their policies to set the external ID right away without doing any further calls. So basically they would be happy to get it fixed because it's also an issue for Terraform CLIs as well.
Okay, so what you're saying, so I was expecting this to be this is just something that comes from the synchronous semantics of Terraform providers. But what you're saying is
partially
that...
yes. Partially yes. I mean, the point where you talked about external create failed annotation is, yes, it's related to Crossplane not being async aware. If Crossplane core was async aware, we could have set that annotation. But because we are lying to Crossplane here, that we are asyncly creating this resource, we are not able to set that annotation. But I mean, we shouldn't be getting into that state in the first place if
Okay.
Terraform had set the ID correctly.
So the synchronous semantics actually, I think you misinterpreted what I was saying about the synchronous semantics. It sounded like
okay.
you were talking about the difference between the like async true, async false in the Upjet configuration, where we have two different clients, one of which wraps the async one that wraps the synchronous one. I'm talking about just the fact that Terraform itself is designed with the idea that everything is blocking and synchronous.
Yes. Yes.
And so if my assumption was that the behavior that I'm observing where it tries to create a resource that results in the resource actually being created and also an error, whether it's a timeout or some other error.
Mm-hmm.
And Terraform returns an object, a state object that contains both a state and an error, but that state doesn't have an ID. You're saying that that's a bug in Terraform, and Terraform, like what Terraform quote unquote should do is, even though it's synchronous, even though it's a failure, there should still be an ID in that state return state object.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's good news. I think that what do you think? So, okay, that's good. That's good news on that. That means that at least some of these things could just be fixed upstream. And then we would still be able to set the right external name, even in an error state. I do kind of think that we should be using external create failed if we tried a create call, we got an error, and at the end of that we don't have a real external name. And I say real here because one of the behaviors that I've noticed is that there's sometimes an external name will get initialized to the metadata name of the resource, even though that's not the external name of the resource, and then get overridden once it gets returned. I don't remember which configs did that, but that's what I meant by sort of a real external name.
But when we
does
say
that
error on
seem like a reasonable approach, correct approach, safe approach, and a feasible approach?
Well, given that we are working asynchronously, I am not sure if we will be able to do that, because the way we do creates right now is that we lie to the core crossplane that create succeeded, and then we go on to try to create the resource. And if it fails, I'm not sure if we will be able to set any annotations. And if it would make sense, because during the create, if we receive any errors, how do we know to stop retrying? Yeah, my knowledge.
I think it would
ends
have to be
there.
based on whether the ID is defined.
ID, well, how do we know about the ID? But when we don't have it there in the first place, if it is not set,
Sure.
we don't know. But if the ID is there, you say, and the creation is failed, you mean? That shouldn't be possible in the first
If the
place.
ID is there and the creation has failed, we should not retry.
Why would the ID be there if the creation has failed? Because we are supposed to set external name annotation after create succeeds.
That's why I said ID and not external name, because you were talking, this is what you were talking about in terms of the semantics of the Terraform provider, where there's an error later on and it returns both an error and a defined ID.
Okay, that makes total sense. But if
And
the
I think in
ID
that case,
is
we
there,
probably should set the external name.
yes. I mean, that should be the case. That was why I was confused. If the ID is there, set by the Terraform, we should set it to the external name annotation. And that means create has succeeded. We should be
Even
able
if
to
there's an error.
observe. Yes,
Yeah.
even if there's an error, yes. And it should be the case, yeah.
So maybe the place to investigate this here is make sure that we are setting the external name whenever we get an ID back from the.
Yeah, I believe it should be the case in the current state of the code. If it's not, I would consider that a bug, and we might investigate it differently, because I believe in the case of this RDS issue, it's similar to what I had worked on, and I can, I guess, create an upstream issue and send them a PR, because I had already worked on this. I'll see.
For Terraform?
Yeah,
For the Terraform provider?
Yep.
Can I ask
Um,
a dumb
okay.
question? I mean, the error here, is it really an error that we're getting, or is it just a timeout that we're getting? Like, we're
in
not.
this case, we're getting a timeout. So in this case, what's happening in the Terraform provider is the call to RDS create DB instance succeeds and returns promptly. And then the provider enters a polling loop inside the same create go method that times out. And so the ID is present in memory in this go routine that the Terraform provider is invoking. It's just because of Terraform synchronous semantics, it's not returning that, because it's supposed to not return it until it's like ready and available.
Gotcha.
But so that's why we don't get the ID, even though like Terraform knows the ID and then forgets it.
Is there any reason we shouldn't have? I mean, maybe this is a dumb question, but like, why do we have timeouts to begin with? Like, I get it kind of, but I'm also like, there also are larger resources to create, like open search domains, right? Take forever to even apply updates to. Like, is it reasonable to have even just like instances that are resources that take longer to create, just setting very long timeouts for? Because we know they could take long times, like RDS instances, RDS clusters, cluster instances, open search domains. Like, is there a reason
So
we don't
the timeout for this resource is 40 minutes. Already.
I would think it should be like 2 or 3 hours, but
okay. Just like that's what's like, we're by default, we're just inheriting whatever timeouts are set in the Terraform provider. And so for this particular resource in the Terraform provider, currently I looked at this issue. This one is set to 40 minutes for RDS instance. Yes, you're right. There's some instances that some resources that take a long time to create. And I'm not. What if we just had absurdly long timeouts or didn't time out? Is a very interesting, dumb question. And I don't have a good answer to that. I wonder if anybody else has a good answer to that.
Yeah, I don't have any good answer to that either, but this could occur without timeouts as well. So any connection errors during the wait period, as I said, credentials expire and requiring renewal, something else, I don't know, just whatever causes Terraform to fail during that wait phase is going to be a problem for us.
yeah, I think that totally makes sense. I'm just wondering, like, should we even just investigate trying to set no timeouts for, like, you know, resources that just we know take a long time, or that like AWS even admits takes a long time?
We certainly have the ability right now in the provider to configure whatever finite timeout we want for any resource, for any operation. There's separate timeouts for like create, update, delete. Maybe
In the
read
provider
somehow has a
code.
timeout. In the Upjet configuration language.
Gotcha.
Like that's one of the handles that we can move. And I think it's used 1 or maybe 2 times in all of provider AWS. Like it's not used very often. But it is there. I'm not sure about setting infinite timeout, but practically there's not much difference between a very large finite timeout and an infinite timeout.
I mean, or is it just possible that we just have a new attribute? I mean, what we could think about is just having an attribute on every MR that says timeout.
Right, that's what I'm thinking in terms of for this. Like in this case, this user has an unusually large database that takes an unusually large time to create. They're not making a new database, they're restoring it from a snapshot. It seems reasonable to me that we would expect in this case, this user to want a larger than normal timeout and have some mechanism, probably an annotation, to be able to set that.
I almost think it's kind of like I mean, I would think it should be in line with management policy, but I don't know. I don't know. Can we create an issue and just like track it? And I
Yeah.
think, yeah,
So let's, I can make an issue for allowing user-defined timeouts on a per resource level. And I will go look into the code for the ID, saving the ID and setting external name when there's an error. Jem, can you handle the how the complications around the fact that we're lying to Crossplane because we're asynchronous?
Oh no. So am I be able to handle that? No, unfortunately not. I mean, that's quite a big undertaking, I believe, and I don't see it happening in the near future, as far
Okay.
as I know. But I'm not in the core Crossplane team,
So
who
that
am
would
I to say that?
require, that would basically require changes to Crossplane runtime in
Yes.
order to get that to support
Yep.
asynchronous operations.
Yep. By the
Um,
way, I might be using core Crossplane wrong here. You are using them more carefully. I bet this is Crossplane runtime's issue of
Mhm.
not being async aware. So it's more like managed reconcilers
Yeah.
than core Crossplane.
And if we, is another option to continue lying to Crossplane runtime and saying external create succeeded, and then once we get the error, setting external create failed and maybe unsetting external create succeeded if necessary? Would that be a possible option, or would that not work for some reason?
I don't think that would work because setting external name means that create has succeeded. Even though we might have received an error, it is probably something proximal. I mean, if the external resource creation has succeeded, we set the external name. Therefore, also setting external create failed won't make sense.
I think the situation where we need to set external create failed is where we tried to create it. Oh yeah, this is really hard because we don't know. We don't know if we're leaking a resource.
Yep. Yeah, creation is unfortunately I mean the root problem here is that we don't have an idempotent API from the external API.
Right.
So we send a bunch of parameters there. In the ideal world, they should correspond to a single resource, which is identified by one of the parameters, for instance. But unfortunately, APIs are not designed according to these needs. So we never be sure that whether our create has failed or something else failed, network failed, timed out, we have no idea. So it's an inherently difficult problem that we are trying to solve here. And
Okay.
we can only base our approach on heuristics. There won't be any guarantees unless the external API gives us guarantees.
So
Can we create a
um,
controller runtime or the crossplane runtime too? Because or at least if there is an issue, that'd be good to know.
what did you say about Crossplane runtime?
Like making it async aware.
That can you at least file an issue for that, Gem?
Yeah, perhaps I can. Perhaps there might also be one existing one. I
Okay.
can file one for you. By the way, I also have plans to submit upstream issues and PRs for the RDS resource specifically. If we encounter the same problem in other resources, I might inspect them, whether they fit the same pattern or there's a different problem that we have to tackle there.
Awesome. This requires new feels like a straightforward bug that I should just make a bug ticket for on like convert this issue to an Upjet bug.
Okay.
I don't see, this doesn't seem like this needs much more discussion. The omit empty, I feel like maybe is worth discussing. I know we're over time.
Yeah, there are bits and pieces, I believe, that needs to be discussed there, because it's a touchy topic that whether something exists or not,
Right.
whether it's empty or not. Well,
Right.
I don't have the full implications of
It's like
going forward with a change there.
like a tri-state Boolean or
Yep. Yeah, in many places we prefer using pointers in the API so that it acts like a tri-state Boolean, but still, I don't know.
I think my thought on it is like if I mean, I think we either go one of two ways. We either just say if you have an empty array, like it just removes everything, and like that's the expected behavior, or you have an empty array, it just expects like it's not there, and we don't do anything with it, and it doesn't matter what's there.
right. And currently
like,
we say the first thing, but do the second, and that's a problem.
Right. So my hunch is that I think the first thing is what we should just be doing, and I think we should, it's a bug. But if we really think the current behavior is the desired behavior, then we should just update the documentation and say this is actually how it works and how you should expect it to work.
I agree that the documented behavior is what I would like it to do, that is a useful behavior to have, that is in keeping with the semantics of the Terraform provider. And the argument that I will make sort of against my own interest is that while looking at this, I found some guideline around making Kubernetes controllers in general that said that you should not distinguish between a empty collection, either array or object, and the value being null or omitted. And that's exactly what this would do. And my guess is that sort of general Kubernetes controller principle is the reason why we're always setting omit empty. So it's kind of a like principle versus practical kind of consideration. Like practically, this would be something that would be useful to do. This would be a convenient way to implement it. And what are we anyways? Are we a Kubernetes controller? Are we a wrapper on Terraform? Are we trying to be sort of more like a principled Kubernetes controller, or are we trying to just sort of provide our users with the most value? That's sort of I feel like that's kind of the argument for which way to go.
I am curious though, if we even apply that principle to compositions, if I apply a claim to the XR and I have an empty array, like if my end users are expecting the Terraform behavior, does Crossplane core actually respect it and will pass an empty object or an empty array all the way to my XR? So when my composition is invoked, I actually have that empty one to make an assertion on. That would be an interesting
I think it doesn't, and I think you're right that it should. Because
Well-
it'll go down to the so what it'll do is it'll go down to the MR. And then this is what happens. It gets like the first version that's stored has it, and then the next version
Doesn't.
like milliseconds later doesn't. So this is the provider. I think what's happening is that the provider is serializing and then deserializing the resource. Or maybe it's the other way around, whatever. Doing a serialization loop, which results in omitting the empty field. And I think that that's a good point, that if we adopt the Kubernetes controller always omit empty behavior, then that is removing expressiveness that our users would otherwise expect to be able to have in terms of things that Terraform can do. And it would mean that there's stuff that we just can't do that Terraform can. And I don't like that idea.
But I'm also trying to like, even as things are passed to me in my composition function, for example, like if I just get a, let's say if I'm doing that serialization in like the SDKs and stuff, I'm just trying to think like, yeah, how do you measure that that empty object or that empty array in a way that even like the SDKs can figure out? Like that's,
I think that's solved. Like I think they can properly
Really?
handle this is a null pointer or nil pointer. This is a pointer to an empty object. Those are different. And like even in the old patch and transform, like if a source field is null, the patch won't run. If the source field is an empty object, the patch will run.
yeah. I didn't think we had this figured out even in Crossplane core of how to deal with this, like, or how we should deal with it, but I could be wrong.
What do you mean by that?
Like, I think going back to like what I was suggesting, if I have a claim with an empty object that goes to the XR, I don't know if the XR also now has that empty object in etcd.
Oh, you're talking about the reconciliation loop between claims and composites.
Yes, and then also just in the way the composite then goes in a composition function. Let's even say that worked. Because I don't know. Let's assume that worked, where then I would have that empty object in etcd on the on the XR. Then when I go into my composition function, do I actually have an ability to modify and work with those things? Like work with an empty object, empty array. Like I don't know if the SDKs actually have a good way of figuring out like, or pointing to nil or empty object or empty array. Not that I've seen in the SDKs, but I could be wrong on the way they serialize or deserialize. Does that make sense or no?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I'd love to hear what Alper thinks. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Alper, we can't hear you. You are muted. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So I'm not following the discussion. Sorry, I need to leave.
I think we should put this up on the conversation for next time, though.
Yep. By the way, I can take the opportunity to leave as well.
Yeah.
It's getting late here.
Thank you, folks.
Matt, we couldn't hear you.
I think when Alper was trying to unmute himself, he clicked mute me. But just saying thanks, bye.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, sorry for that. I just clicked on the user interface and I saw an mute
Wrong button.
Yeah, sorry for that.
Okay. Okay. See you next time then, guys.
Bye.
Bye. See you.